Welcome to a new series on the WORKOLOGY podcast that we are kicking off that focuses on the future of work. This series is in collaboration with the Partnership on Employment and Accessible Technology, or PEAT. You can learn more about PEAT at peatworks.org. The area of virtual reality and augmented reality is a growing space. The VR industry has increased to 90 million active users in 2017 and is projected to increase to 171 million users in 2018. I've had a number of podcast interviews over the last 3 years that touch on the topic of AR and VR for HR and recruitment. It is really just starting to emerge as a powerful technology and tool for the workplace. Question is, how do we make these emerging technologies more accessible for all employees and job candidates? That's what we're going to be talking about today on the WORKOLOGY podcast. Welcome to the WORKOLOGY podcast. This is a part of an ongoing series we are continuing that focuses on the future of work. This series is in collaboration with the Partnership on Employment and Accessible Technology, or PEAT. Today I'm joined with Beth Crutchfield and Jessie Hawk. Beth Crutchfield is the Vice President of Strategic Consulting and Training Services with Level Access. Jessie Hawk is an accessibility specialist, also with Level Access. Level Access has been in the accessibility business since Section 508 and WCAG existed, and longer than any of its competitors. During this time, they have supported the accessibility initiatives of more than 1,000 organizations, from leading government agencies to enterprise-class firms to smaller-sized companies. Beth and Jessie, welcome to the WORKOLOGY podcast. So let's start with Beth first. Can you tell us a little bit more about your background?
Yes. So as you mentioned, my title is VP of Strategic Consulting and Training Services. I've been with Level Access just about 3 years, just a few months shy of 3 years. Prior to that, I worked for Capital One Financial Corporation for about 20 years. And in my last role at Capital One, I stood up and ran their digital accessibility governance program. So that was the bulk of my last 5 years with Capital One, and the 15 years prior, I spent a tremendous amount of time in the legal regulatory space, standing up policy program infrastructures for all the key laws and regs and support processes inside Capital One tied to regulatory and legal matters. So a lot of depth from the legal regulatory space, and then a lot of depth in the technology space.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for joining. I can't wait to hear you give us some more insights into virtual reality and augmented reality. Jessie, what about you? Tell us a little bit about your background.
Yes. Hi again. My name is Jessie Hawk. I'm an accessibility specialist here with Level Access. I am also the head of research and development for the Able Gamers charity, which is a partner with Level Access. And that's where primarily my background comes from, is with accessibility within the realm of video games, but then also with the emergence of virtual and augmented reality, where my background is coming in, but primarily with also Level Access focus on the services side, doing testing of our different clients' software and websites to ensure that they are, WCAG and 508 compliant. So it's great to be here.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about maybe some of the exciting technology projects or things that Level Access is working on or has worked on in the past. Walk us through that.
Yeah, absolutely. So definitely right now, and for the years to come, we're really doing a revamp and working on our AMP platform. So our AMP platform it stands for Accessibility Management Platform. And it's where our clients can use our platform for all their accessibility needs, whether it be testing, whether also looking up different standards, and they can do in-house testing with our platform and work on fixing those accessibility issues in-house, also while using us as a resource. So that's definitely one of our great kind of technologies that we have here at Level Access. We also have our analytics tool as well. And what's neat is that it's this JavaScript that can spider through any one of our clients, say web applications, for example, and actually pick up the accessibility issues, but then also bring back data to the client and stating kind of what kind of end users are using their websites currently. Is it keyboard-only users, users who are blind? Is it users using a wide, different assistive technologies? So it's really that important data for them to know who's their audience and who's they're using their website. So we also have our analytics tool as well.
I love that. I think about the HR and recruiting space and maybe how your career site could really use some of the technology that you guys have available to help make the hiring process more accessible.
And in addition to what Jessie mentioned, we do have a couple of other things that are a little bit noteworthy. So a lot of the stuff that we do in my team space, we offer packages of deliverables for specific purposes addressing policy and governance. So we have Access Blueprint, which kind of sets the foundation of a governance infrastructure for an organization that's looking to, adopt an accessibility policy or be proactive with respect to things like AR and VR. Then in addition to that, we have several other packages. One is called Access Inventory, where we help to kind of do an inventory of what your assets look like that might be at risk from an accessibility perspective, especially in the AR VR space. And then we have one that also is called Access Response, and that's used in situations where you might be faced with litigation. It's a package that kind of offers a standard set of services that will help you as you navigate the legal landscape in this space. And then the last thing I would mention is a product that's tied to AMP called Continuum, and this is for use in situations where you're doing continuous integrated testing during your software development lifecycle. And so that product is coming out later this year and is in heavy development at this stage.
Wow, that's a lot of different options and offerings, but I feel like there are so many questions and technology's changing, so you guys cover a lot of ground. So our podcast today focuses on accessibility of virtual reality and augmented reality. Can you explain to us the difference between VR or virtual reality versus AR, augmented reality, for those of us who might not be aware or familiar?
Yeah, absolutely. So just to go kind of, really baseline foundational, what is virtual reality, or often I'll refer to as VR? And it's a computer-generated simulation of a three-dimensional image or an environment that can be interacted with in a seemingly real or physical way by someone who's using, special electronic equipment. So you see oftentimes people with a helmet with a screen over their eyes, or they have gloves on that has sensors. So VR is really a way where the end user, someone who's using it, is completely cut off from their own reality. They're in this whole new virtual reality. So that's where it kind of comes into play, the seemingly kind of real reality that they experience, because they are cut from their own actual reality. And then on the other side, you have augmented reality, or AR for short. And this is actually technology that superimposes, say, a computer-generated image on the user's real world. So providing kind of a composite view. So for this, the end user is still in their true reality, but there's a computer-generated image in their reality that's through a screen. So I like, my best example for this one is Pokemon Go. I bet many listeners that either have kids have heard of Pokemon Go. So that's kind of a good example of augmented reality. An example of virtual reality, which maybe not as many have heard of, would be, say, a Batman Arkham VR, but something definitely to YouTube so you can kind of see an example of VR.
Wonderful. Thank you for insights in those areas. I am a huge Pokemon Go. I still occasionally, mostly because of a 9-year-old little girl, do log in and we like to go chase Pokemon. So it's popular.
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun. And I will say that I have participated in Pokemon Go without the child and with friends. So it's a great activity and a good example of augmented reality technology.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
A lot of recruiting and HR teams are adding VR and AR components into their recruiting and hiring processes. For example, I talked to Gap in a previous podcast episode where they use VR as a virtual office tour giving candidates an experience into what it's like to work in their San Francisco and New York offices. I loved their VR experience, and I remember asking about accessibility for people with disabilities for VR and AR. Can you talk us through some of the accessibility work you're doing in this area?
So definitely with the accessibility work within VR and AR, we're actually doing a lot of work with our partner, Able Gamers Charity, the charity that I mentioned earlier that I'm involved with. And we've been doing some trials on different ways to make different VR and AR applications accessible, using best practices that we use already for game development and extrapolating some of those best practices when needed within the VR and AR realm. So that's currently the accessibility work that we're doing in this area, more of trial and error, seeing what works versus what doesn't work, and for which individuals these different avenues do and don't work.
Let's take a bit of a reset here. This is Jessica Miller-Merrill, and you're listening to the Workology podcast in partnership with PEAT. Today we're talking about VR and AR accessibility with Beth Crutchfield and Jessie Hawk.
The Workology podcast Future of Work series is supported by PEAT, the Partnership on Employment and Accessible Technology. PEAT's initiative is to foster collaboration and action around accessible technology in the workplace. PEAT is funded by the U.S. Department of Labor's Office of Disability Employment Policy, ODEP. Learn more about PEAT at peatworks.org. That's PEATWORKS.org.
One of the things I love about virtual reality is it is truly an immersive experience. And I think your explanation and definition of virtual reality was on. You put that headset on and you're transported to a completely different place, oblivious of everything around you. I just saw Ready Player One this weekend, finally, and I thought that was a really great movie. If you want to really understand what virtual reality is about, I think it's a great movie to maybe check out and experience.
Awesome. It's still on my bucket list to check out.
Yeah, my husband was like, that was a good one. I'm not a big movie person, but we went on a date this weekend, and I was like, let's go see this one. There was a lot of buzz around it during South by Southwest, and I thought, maybe it's time. But I thought it was a great representation of maybe the future of virtual reality and some of the challenges that we might experience. I think that sometimes when it comes to accessibility, though, we might assume accommodations or designs are made just for physical reasons. That's across the board. But when it comes to virtual reality, I think that's also it's not always true. Can you talk about some of the virtual reality design updates that are in a non-physical nature that you're working with right now?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, you're right. There's sometimes a misconception that we're focusing on mobility only. And that might be something of, again, VR and AR in regards to technology timeframe is in its infancy currently. But there are three other groups that, we should always focus on when we think about accessibility in this field is, visual, auditory, and cognitive. So definitely with visual, being I guess the whole end goal with any of these is that you always want to provide options to the users and that they can turn on or off options. Just having that availability just makes a world of difference. But definitely with visual, what's neat is, doing changeable text and color sizes. So say you're doing the, office tour with virtual reality, having text that say what the different meeting rooms are, for example, or the where someone's desk maybe is. Someone being able to enlarge that text size, especially as, we get older as well, the aging population, being able to enlarge that text is really important. Also, different colorblind options as well to be available is a really great accessibility best practice to include. Definitely also for visual, especially for low vision users. The auditory placement, also event stimulus updates. So I know that was kind of large, weird words I just used, but for anyone with low vision, having kind of that audio description of what they're perceiving within the VR world. So audio announcements, for example, including that to audio describe the environment that someone's in. You also want to think about kind of auditory best practices. So changeable fonts and colors does come back into this, but then you also have in-view closed captioning. So There's probably many of times where we turned on closed captioning, whether there's a sleeping baby in the next room or your spouse is sleeping or something. Closed captioning is really important also in virtual reality specifically. So for that, I mean, I really see it as like a usability recommendation as well. You also have, cognitive group, and that's mostly, when needed, you want to have different tutorials. So even just how to interact with the VR application, tutorials like that is really important. Intuitive menus. And again, I put that to usability, having intuitive menus for someone to use, especially if it's their first time. So also with cognitive, and it does tie in some to mobility, but I think this ties across the board, is also vertigo. So sometimes, especially people with disabilities, one of the traits they may have due to their disability is they can get vertigo sometimes easily. And that's a big issue that's happening right now with VR especially. And I mean, me as just a typical end user, I got vertigo. One time I was actually doing a VR testing of a roller coaster. And I think that was, the worst idea for me especially, was to be on a VR roller coaster. But, we did the testing and we told them, if you give the option for someone to slow this kind of movement down so that they can handle it and enjoy it at like their speed, that's really beneficial. So again, that all ties back into that customization and providing those options, and not just, mobility is critical, it's very important, but then to continue to keep in mind that you have these other three categories as well to make sure that whatever is being created is as accessible as possible.
Another growing area in the AR and VR space for workplace and human resources is training and employee communications. Can you talk about maybe some of the other ways you've seen AR and VR being used in the workplace?
Yeah, so definitely for training. I think we've all heard the kind of death by PowerPoint, trainings, and that right now there's new ways that we're not just relying on PowerPoint, very visual kind of stimulus. So definitely, virtual board meetings I think is really cool. So being able to kind of, in that own virtual reality, you're in the same room as everyone else. It adds a new avenue to learning with employee training. So, say again, maybe with the HR realm, say it's in the medical field, for example. What if you could have that beating heart in AR right in front of you as you're training someone how to do some different medical procedure, for example? That's a great way to use AR and AR specifically in that way. And that's, seeing it being used in that way in the workplace. I think there are a few that are using it in that mode. I've also seen VR used with physical therapy and occupational therapy as well, especially, for, military members coming back over, and maybe they're missing a limb and they're trying to learn to walk again, and, they're using different prosthetics. They put on a virtual reality helmet and they're walking through a space, but what they're actually doing is they're truly walking, but they look down, they see both of their legs in their virtual reality. So it's really neat that they're practicing walking, even though they're on the prosthetics, but in their virtual reality, they have both of their legs. So it helps that brain to physical connection. So I've also seen that's another really cool way VR is being used in the workplace.
I love all those ideas. I think that there's a huge future in these particular areas. There's also a lot of technology and development and videos and VR recording that's going to need to be able to happen before all these things are maybe available for employees. Let's say you're a mechanic and you need to learn how to repair a car or an aircraft or something like that. You can take advantage of VR in these different ways.
Oh, absolutely. And even in that case, what I also really love about, say for example, a first-time mechanic learning how to fix a plane, it's much safer for them to practice in a virtual reality environment than in the true reality. Because if you mess up in virtual reality, there's no consequences. There's no real world consequences there. So it can practice over and over again. Whereas, practicing in the real world, and if something goes wrong, there's that real world consequence with that. So I think absolutely VR is a great mode for that as well.
If one of our listeners is wanting to add VR or AR to maybe their training or their employee experience or their recruiting programs, where do you think they should begin? How do they get started?
For that, I mean, it's all about working with developers in the field of virtual and augmented reality. From there, starting the storyboards of, what do they want from this application, and starting up this early development stages of what is their goal with their application. So if it is a recruiting program, what kind of end goals do they have for that recruiting program that they want to see, and working with those developers. And from there, making sure that accessibility is being talked about at the very beginning of development, because it is much easier and also much cheaper to include accessibility best practices at the beginning and throughout that development lifecycle than doing it retroactively afterwards. So that would, my advice.
This is Beth. The one thing I would add here is just that as you're thinking about this and using this in your own internal environment, in addition to what Jessie mentioned, you might also want to be thinking about what accessibility standards you want to adopt. If you have any in place already, making sure that the VR and AR that you implement is aligned to those standards as well. And then also beginning perhaps that journey that we talked about earlier around thinking about inventorying your assets that are AR, VR, and what accessibility support that you have in place. That way, in case folks are asking questions, you are in a position to be able to answer those with respect to where the accessibility stands with your AR and VR, and then also folding that into any internal governance that you have related to accessibility would be an important other step to consider.
So one other question I wanted to ask, but I wanted to ask you guys before I did, is do you guys have any resources in those areas that we can maybe point to folks to on the Level Access site, or some sort of video or ebook or, I don't know, online resource that they could go for more information?
I mean, I think that as far as more information about AR and VR, or about like what we're talking about
the accessibility piece of it, because for so many people, I feel like this is really new. Josh and I just spoke at SHRM Talent, so HR and recruiting conference, and we talked about e-recruiting and making your website accessible. And probably 90% of the people in the room, it was the first time they had ever heard this conversation. So where do people go? Do you have some resources on the Level Access site, or some different places that you could direct people to be able to get some more information on VR, AR, and accessibility?
Yeah, so listeners can go to our Level Access website where they can learn more about accessibility and the work that we do. In regards to accessibility directly with virtual and augmented reality, Beth and I did just attend a conference recently where we talked about accessibility in this field, and they can download our PowerPoint presentation from the website as well. And then
it sounds like you also have an accessibility gaming white paper that we're going to try to link to in the resources section of the podcast as well.
Yes. With that white paper, it's focused on accessibility in video game development, but there are best practices you can extrapolate from there for virtual and augmented reality.
It's interesting because a lot of HR and recruiting teams are also looking at gamification as an area to drive engagement and activity, and even in the application process. So I'm sure add accessibility into that too. There'll probably be a lot of really good pieces of information that they can pull from that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, Beth and Jessie, thank you so much for joining us today. Where can people go? I know we talked about the Level Access website, but where can they go to get in touch with you? So let's say they want to have a conversation more about accessibility and VR and AR. Where do they go to connect with you?
So for me, they can. I'm happy to connect on LinkedIn, and I can provide that.
And this is Beth. I would say the same. Happy to connect with folks outside in the LinkedIn space.
Awesome. I will be sure to include directly in the transcript links to both Beth and Jessie's LinkedIn profiles, so you can connect with them there, and then shoot them over a message and help get folks started on accessibility in the workplace for the subject of AR and VR. Thank you so much, guys, for taking the time to join the podcast today. I really appreciate your insights in this fast developing, emerging area.
Certainly. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good rest of your day.
I love hearing about how these new technologies are growing and the different ways and methods that you can make them more accessible to everyone. I look forward to touching base with Level Access again to get an update on how this new industry has evolved and the strides and case studies that are being made in VR and AR accessibility. There is a growing trend in our workplaces where technology from consumer markets is finding a home and application in our offices. It's important for us as HR and workplace leaders to make time to understand, consider, and make room for these uses and applications in the businesses that we support. Thank you for joining the Workology Podcast, a podcast for the disruptive workplace leader who's tired of the status quo. This is Jessica Miller-Merrill. Until next time, you can visit workology.com to listen to all our previous Workology podcast episodes.
Production services for the Workology Podcast with Jessica Miller-Merrill provided by TotalPicture.com.